C60 olive oil is a popular choice for people wanting to activate their full potential. Improved sleep, faster recovery and more energy are just a few of the amazing comments received from our customers who take a spoonful a day. Make C60 oil a part of your daily routine and see what it can do for you. Activate your potential today at thec60company.com.
I don't know what is a bigger myth, that bin Laden was behind 9/11 or Prince Andrew doesn't sweat, doesn't do PDAs, doesn't go out dressed casually in London. Just jumping back to what we talked about earlier then.
I can give you a quick one on that.
Yeah, go for it.
Robert Mueller, Russiagate and all that stuff. He was actually appointed head of the FBI 2 weeks before 9/11, right? Which I feel it in me water wasn't a coincidence. Anyway, he actually said, as head of the FBI, that there was not enough evidence for the 19 hijackers to being responsible to put it in a court of law, and that there wasn't enough evidence for bin Laden, right? And when I started investigating 9/11, which was basically from the day, one of the people I was in correspondence with for a book called Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center Disaster, came out in 2002, was a guy, the strange name of Rex Toome. Rex Toome. And we corresponded a bit when I was asking questions because he was a spokesman for the FBI. And someone else, more recently, a few years ago now, asked Rex Toome on behalf of the FBI why on their page about bin Laden, most wanted terrorist, was his list of crimes, or did his list of crimes not include 9/11? And Rex Toome, on behalf of the FBI, said because there's not enough hard evidence that he was involved. So, manipulators have known since Noah was a lad that, or is that anti-Semitic? I don't know. It was just an historical character that came into my mind. Let's say Plato was a lad then. That if you keep repeating a lie, eventually it becomes the truth. And this is how they work. And the media, of course, which is ultimately owned by this cult, if you go deep enough, they play the game of repeating untruths till they become an everyone knows that, mate. And so what they've done with 9/11 is just keep repeating untruths, and it just becomes, in the perception of not everybody, there's a lot of skepticism, but a lot of people, that's how it was. It wasn't like that at all.
So Russia invades Afghanistan. Russia leaves Afghanistan. The Mujahideen are fighting. They're backed by the CIA and the Americans. So the story is then, the plot is that bin Laden then turns his sights on the West and on the Americans, generating this hatred that culminates with 9/11. What's your response to that?
Well, it's a load of old crap. I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor when Carter was president, he admitted to a French news magazine some years after he was with Carter that they had systematically manipulated the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. And they, in his words, they wanted to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. Because although people that invade Afghanistan cause a lot of death and destruction, they never win. It's basically a place where you can't win. You just keep on fighting, knowing that there's no end in sight. It's what's happening to the Americans now. So at that time, the government in Kabul, the capital, was a Soviet satellite government. So to draw the Soviet Union in, they wanted to put that Kabul government in danger of being overthrown. So they created the Mujahideen and funded them, and they wanted a frontman who would be the kind of focal point of the resistance to the Soviets. And it was Osama bin Laden from this big-time Bush family-connected bin Laden family in Saudi Arabia. And he's the good guy then. Oh, that Osama bin Laden, he's lovely, he is. He's fighting the Soviets. He believes in democracy. Comes from Saudi Arabia. Anyway, and then the Soviets left, leaving a million dead Afghans behind. And then there was this morphing where Robin Cook, who at one point was foreign secretary in the Labour government, and to his eternal credit, resigned from office. He was in a different government position then, over the invasion of Iraq. He, after he'd stepped down as a minister, etc., he said, I think it was in The Guardian, that Al-Qaeda means the base or the database because the people that were the, if you like, members of Al-Qaeda were basically the same people on the CIA database of Mujahideen fighters who fought the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So what happened was that the Mujahideen, oh, they're the good guys, they're fighting for freedom, suddenly became Al-Qaeda. Same people. Only this time, the scripts changed and the shows changed, the vaudevilles changed. Now they're the bad people, right? So now we have an excuse to do things because we're fighting the bad people that we wouldn't before. You know, if you want to go into a country and you don't have an excuse, then say there's a terrorist group there that's a threat to America or a threat to the world, and you're in. This is how it works. And of course, Al-Qaeda morphed into Al-Nusra and ISIS and all these people. It's basically the old technique of creating an enemy to justify the fight, creating an enemy to justify the war, justify going into countries you wouldn't have an excuse to do if you didn't create an enemy. And then, of course, that enemy was blamed for 9/11, which was a great way of obscuring who really did it.
Just going on a sidetrack there, we recently had the global announcement that the head of ISIS had been killed.
What, again?
How many times had he been killed by other countries?
Yeah, and why do they keep burying him at sea? They buried bin Laden at sea. You know, he's a Muslim from Saudi Arabia, not Jack Bloody Sparrow, is he? It's unbelievable. But, of course, why did they bury him at sea? So there's no evidence. It's so simple. Crazy, man.
So if Osama bin Laden was the hero fighting the Russians, then he becomes the enemy.
Yep.
How is it that the Bush family are able to maintain such tightness with his family? Isn't his family a massive construction?
That's right, in Saudi Arabia.
Could you expand on the bin Laden family and the relationship with Bush?
Well, this is what it comes down to. This, okay? You are involved in the Sabbatean Frankist cult, which goes into extreme Islam, it goes into Judaism, it goes into America, it goes into Britain, etc., etc. But outwardly, because this is the way the cult works, you appear to be a member and a supporter of a country or a culture or an organization. So then you hear people say, well, why would the bin Ladens do this? Why would they do that? Because they're thinking that what they appear to be is who they are. They're not. So if you have the Bush family connected to this cult, you have the bin Laden family connected to this cult, you have the Saudi royal family connected to this cult, you have those that control Israel connected to this cult, and so on and so forth, around the world and around Europe, then suddenly you see how people that appear to be even in opposition to each other, actually are working as one unit. But the other people around them, like the general Jewish population in Israel, the general Saudi population, will not know this. American population, they won't know this. They'll take everything on face value. This is a cult which has an agenda for human control on a global and technological level. Therefore, country borders are irrelevant. Why would an American do that? Why would a Saudi Arabian do that? Why would a Jew do that? Why would somebody from Islam do that? Hindu do that? Because they are those labels, but only in theory. And actually, they're all connected. And once you realize that there are those connections, then why someone would do something that's apparently not in the interests of what they appear to represent becomes totally clear. So, once you realize the existence of the cult, then if the Bin Ladens are members of the cult and the Bushes are members of the cult, well, they're gonna operate as one unit and support the goals and support the outcome. And so they were very close. The particularly Father Bush and the Bin Laden family. And I've talked to people that were been in mind control projects in America, in MK Ultra and elite aspects of the MK Ultra mind control project, who were close to George Bush, who were basically slaves to George Bush, mind control slaves to George Bush, and heard a hell of a lot going on. And they very openly that the Saudi government was the Saudi royal family was answering to Bush. Because the hierarchy, you see, the hierarchy of power, the hierarchy of control is not where you are in the hierarchy of your country. It's where you are in the hierarchy of the cult. So if Father Bush, God, not boy Bush, Father Bush, was higher in the cult hierarchy than the Saudi royal family, then they take orders from him, even though they're the Saudi royal family and he's a one-time president. This is how it works. And it's this network that pulled off 9/11 because it was operating in America and it was operating in Israel. It was operating in Saudi Arabia. That's why most of the alleged hijackers were Saudi Arabian. And you've got families, and I do completely understand why, in America, who are seeking to challenge the Saudi royal family in court for their involvement in 9/11, but they're missing the cult. And I understand why. I mean, not many people know about it, but once you realize that the cult connections, then it wasn't just Saudi Arabia. It was those controlling Israel and Mossad and the Israeli intelligence community in general, Shin Bet, the domestic agency. It was those controlling the CIA. What I've been talking about all these years. Now is openly talked about. They call it the deep state. But the point is the cult controls the deep state. That's why the deep state does what it does.
This takes us into the book, The Trigger, and you write about the planes that were allowed to fly after everybody else had been grounded.
I'll tell you two, and it will be so relevant to what I've just said.
Yep.
2 planes were allowed to leave America after all planes except military were grounded. One flew members of the Bin Laden family, ironically out of Boston Logan, where the first 2 planes left, and another one was an El Al Israeli flight out of New York. Who was leaving? Members of the cult were leaving. That's why.
So in a criminal investigation, if your family member was suspected of, one of the worst tragedies in history, 9/11, you would immediately go to those family members and interview them to get information about his whereabouts and, the possibility of this happening. So the complete opposite was they were pushed out the country.
Yeah, get away. Oh, they weren't the only ones either.
All right, so we've talked about
It was a scam. It's a total scam. There's not one strand of the 9/11 official story that fits with another.
So we've brought the Bush family into this nicely, and I've researched the Bushes all the way back to the money laundering for the Nazis. But there are two other very interesting characters involved here, and you write about them extensively in the book. Perhaps if you could just give a bit of a summary about them and their roles. We've got Cheney and we've got Rumsfeld.
Well, why don't I give you a little sequence of events, which will bring them in. Here's a sequence. In 1979, a man called Issa Harel, who's known as the father of Israeli intelligence, did an interview with an American journalist in which he predicted that there would be an Arab attack on New York's biggest building. He had in mind the Empire State Building, but of course the biggest buildings on 9/11 were the Twin Towers. Also in 1979, Benjamin Netanyahu organized a conference in Jerusalem to call for a war on terrorism. Father Bush attended it. And for preemptive strikes against terrorist states before they did any terrorism. In 1984, Benjamin Netanyahu organized another one in America, and it was attended by the American government and military elite, calling for a war on terrorism. He wrote a book around the same time. In 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu was prime minister of Israel by 1996, and a group of ultra-Zionists, led by a guy called Richard Pearl, produced a document for Netanyahu called a clean break, securing the realm being Israel, which called for Saddam Hussein to be removed from Iraq, which called for Syria and Iran to be targeted, and said that the more inter-Arab conflict we can create, the better. A year later, 1997, an organization was created in America called the Project for the New American Century. One of its key members was Richard Pearl, who did the clean break. And the co-founders of the Project for the New American Century were William Crystal, ultra-Zionist, and Robert Kagan, ultra-Zionist. Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was the State Department's head of Eurasian affairs, who oversaw the American coup in Ukraine. Everything connects. It's a very small world with this cult. So that started in 1997. In 1998, this same group wrote to President Clinton calling for Saddam Hussein to be overthrown in Iraq. We're starting to get the picture. In the year 2000, in September 2000, this Project for the New American Century, among whose members were Dick Cheney, who would be 9/11 de facto president, officially vice president, Donald Rumsfeld, who would be 9/11 defense secretary, Paul Wolfowitz, who would be his deputy, but the real power in the Pentagon, Dov Zakheim, who would control ultra-Zionist, who would control the whole of the Pentagon budget at the time of 9/11. And on September the 10th, the day before the attacks, the Pentagon announced that they'd lost $2.3 trillion. It had just gone missing, right? Well, I've got an idea what some of it was spent on, chaps. But anyway, and of course, they announced it on September the 10th, and not many people heard about it because something happened the next day, which these people knew was going to happen, of course. That's why they did it on the 10th. so this is what you had, this group of people. Also among the project for the New American Century was Richard Pearl, Netanyahu's mate, who wrote Clean Break, and John Bolton, who's been calling until he got removed by Trump, all along has been calling for regime change in a series of Arab countries. He's never seen a country he didn't want to bomb, John Bolton. So that's document that this Project for the New American Century produced in September 2000 called for a series of countries to be regime changed using American troops. And basically, the foundation of it was what was in the Clean Break, securing the realm of Israel. So instead of using Israeli troops, they wanted to use American troops to do what benefited Israel, what benefited the cult, basically. And so they wanted regime change in September 2000 in Iraq, Libya, Iran, Lebanon, and other countries, including North Korea, leading eventually to regime change in China. And that was what they wanted. They called in this document, and it was an ultra-Zionist organization, the Project for the New American Century. They called for American troops to fight and decisively win multiple theater wars in these countries to regime change. But they also said in this document, September 2000, that this, what they called in the quote, process of transformation, regime change, would necessarily be slow because they wouldn't have the support to do it, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year to the month after that document was published, 9 months after these people came to power with Bush, America had what Bush called at the time the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century, 9/11. And as a result of those attacks, these countries have been ticked off ever since in what was called, quoting Netanyahu back in the 70s and 80s, a war on terror. According to the New York Times, I'm taking through a timeline here. According to the New York Times, on September the 19th and 20th, 2001, immediately after the attacks, this same group of people I'm talking about, operating under the defense, a defense organization out of the Pentagon, decided that Saddam Hussein had to be removed from Iraq. So you're seeing the progression here. Then we have General Wesley Clark, who was a former Supreme Commander of NATO, who went on an kind of alternative internet TV program called Democracy Now! In 2007, and described his experience immediately after 9/11. He said he went to the Pentagon, he met Rumsfeld, he met Wolfowitz, and then went down and met a general friend of his in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the uniform level of the Pentagon hierarchy. And this general, he said, told him days after 9/11 they were going to invade Iraq. Well, that kind of fits because that's where we've been leading. And you can see where the Iraq thing came from now. His question was, why are we going to invade Iraq? Had everything to do with 9/11? They said, well, we don't think so, but we're going to invade Iraq. It's coming from upstairs. So Clark goes away, comes back a few weeks later, by which time America's in Afghanistan. And by the way, within an hour or so of the attacks, Ehud Barak, brackets, friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who was the Prime Minister of Israel into the early months of 2001. He went on the BBC immediately after the attacks and pointed the finger for them at Osama bin Laden and talked about an invasion of Afghanistan, right? This is a guy who was also a massive figure in Israeli intelligence. So they're in Afghanistan by now. And he says he went back, Clark. He said he went back, and he met his general friend again, who said, well, he said to him, why haven't we invaded Iraq? I thought we were going to invade Iraq. He said, it's worse than that, sir, He said, we just had this from upstairs, and he pulled up a piece of paper, Clark said, and he said, we're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. And the countries he named were all from the Project the New American Century document in September 2000. Included Syria, and which was also on the Project the New American Century document, Assad, getting rid of him, Libya, Syria, all of them, they were all there, Iran, etc. And so you see the cult's influence in the sense that at the time of 9/11, you had Bush, Republican, in the White House, and you had Blair, Labour, it says here, in Downing Street, and they invade Afghanistan, and then they invade Iraq. Oh, Benjamin, you got it at last after all this time, right? On a lie, of course. And people say, why did they lie about weapons of mass destruction? Because it's on the list and they don't have an excuse, so they made one up to tick it off the list. It is simple when you realize how it works. But then Blair goes and Bush goes. And in comes Bush's opponent, Obama, Democrat, and in comes Blair's opponent, Cameron, Conservative. And they pick off Libya and then start the process of the catastrophe of a fake civil war orchestrated by the same forces we've talked about, the paid mercenary terrorists, etc., in Syria. And then they go. And in comes the maverick Trump. And I put it on the internet when he came to power, key word of Trump's administration, Iran. And of course, they've been targeting Iran vehemently and actually had planes in the air to attack them at one point a few weeks ago before Trump pulled it back overwhelmingly, it seems to me, from the circumstances of the time, because it had been pointed out to him the consequences electorally of him invading Iran, given that he got to power to a massive extent by saying he was going to stop all that nonsense, right? Anyway, but now they're doing it with sanctions and trying to create unrest and protests that turn into people regime change. So here you have a situation where this ultra-Zionist, I say cult, organization names the countries, says we need a Pearl Harbor to justify it. Pearl Harbor happens. People that called for Pearl Harbor and regime change come to power, and regime change. I mean, hello? I mean, anyone home? So then you think, okay, so who oversaw the entire investigation of 9/11? A guy called Michael Chertoff, ultra Zionist, who was appointed in 2001, before 9/11, as the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, which oversaw the investigation. And so Michael Chertoff oversaw the investigation. He also wrote the Patriot Act, which clearly had been written before 9/11, which was then brought out immediately afterwards to take away basic freedoms in America, justified by protecting the public against terrorism, and then becomes head of Homeland Security to impose and enforce the Patriot Act that he'd written. How many people know this? That in 2001, 200 Israelis were arrested in America for being part of a spy ring. 140 were arrested before 9/11, and 60 were arrested afterwards. Many of them were posing as art students when they clearly weren't. They gave a university in Israel where they were doing their art. That university turned out not to exist. And there were a number of centers that they worked out of, and all this came out through a leaked document from the Drug Enforcement Administration. Without that, it wouldn't have come out. But the key place these documents said the Israeli spy ring was based was a place called Hollywood in Florida, not far from Miami, which was where 15 of the 19 alleged hijackers operated out of, including Mohammed Attar. And they were even where these art students were and where Mohammed Attar was extremely close. And there were other areas in New Jersey that they operated, these art students and other members of this ring, where these alleged hijackers also operated. It was a remarkable coincidence.
Does this include the dancing Israelis?
Yeah, I'm coming to them, yeah. So what happened was that they were questioned by the FBI, etc. And then along came Michael Chertoff, ultra-Zionist, head of the criminal division of the Justice Department. He let them go. All this came out, not just through those documents, but through a series of reports, I think there were 4 of them, by a Fox News reporter called Carl Cameron. Excellent reports, where he just revealed all this stuff. Of course, they were off the Fox website very quickly, never to be seen again, but some people downloaded them. You can still see them if you work to find them. And then you mentioned, yes, the dancing Israelis. This was also a part of this. On 9/11, a woman was looking out of her apartment, looking across the river to the Twin Towers. The first tower, the North Tower, had just been hit. And she saw these, what she described as Middle East-looking men. And of course, the immediate reaction were they're Arabs. They weren't. They were Israelis. And they were with a white van filming the tower burning. Only one at that time. And other witnesses swear they were there before the first tower was hit. And they were whooping and high-fiving, and this is where the term dancing Israelis came from. And they clearly had prior knowledge of the attack. And 2 of them were known to the FBI, it turned out, as Mossad operatives, right? So she reports them to the police, and eventually they get picked up. They're held for 71 days. It turns out that they were connected to a company in New Jersey called Urban Moving Systems, which was headed by a guy called Dominic Suter. Dominic Suter, not surprisingly, when they investigated this, was questioned by the FBI and told that they would be back for a second interview. Well, they weren't, because he was on a plane to Israel, and that was it. Although I've heard, I've just updated the book for the second print run, I now hear that years later he came back to America and no one said anything. He worked and worked and worked. No problem whatsoever, right? So you see in the book the background to it. Now the FBI and police were absolutely sure that they were connected to the event. How would you know otherwise? This Urban Moving Systems was just a front. Just after 9/11, everything shut down. Everyone left, ran. Just a front. Box cutters, boxes, and all this stuff. And they were held by the FBI for 71 days. And then Michael Chertoff, ultra-Zionist, head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, let them go without charging them for anything to do with 9/11. And some of the people supporting that included a well-known ultra-Zionist politician called Chuck Schumer, and a very well-known ultra-Zionist lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, who, of course, is was a close friend and associate of Jeffrey Epstein. And so you had this clear Israeli ring operating in the same areas as the alleged hijackers were operating, who were just let go. You had these 5 Israelis who clearly had prior knowledge of the attacks, 2 of them who were known Mossad agents, and they're let go. And wherever you look with 9/11, the same theme occurs. Who bought the lease to the Twin Towers weeks before 9/11? Larry Silverstein, ultra-Zionist, and Frank Lowy, ultra-Zionist. Silverstein was such a close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu. This has been reported by the Israeli press as well as the alternative, that he and Netanyahu used to have a telephone chat every Sunday. What happened is that the Twin Towers were a bit of a white elephant, really. They were under-occupied and they were getting out of date, and they weren't a good buy. But Silverstein and Lowy, dominated by Silverstein, bought the Twin Towers and immediately significantly increased the insurance in the event of a terrorist attack. This meant that for a personal investment in the lease of $14 million, Silverstein and co. were paid out in insurance $4.56
Holy shit.
billion.
Wow.
And the person who did the deal for the insurance was a guy called Morris Greenberg, ultra-Zionist, friend of Henry Kissinger, who was from the AIG insurance giant. And being very canny, or maybe he was a prophet, who knows, he sold the insurance on immediately to about 24 other companies who took the hit. Right. Now, before I continue that thread, another one. Israeli intelligence was trying to get control of security at the Twin Towers since at least 1987. They first applied for it through a company called Atwell Security that was a subsidiary of the Eisenberg group, of a guy called Shaul Eisenberg, who was a massive Israeli intelligence operative, ran Zim Shipping. Zim Shipping, by the way, left the World Trade Center a week before the 9/11 and broke its lease to do so. Another coincidence, nothing to worry about. And he was involved in the terror groups like Irgun that bombed and terrorized Israel into existence in 1948. So Atwell Security was run by Israeli intelligence agents who worked with Issa Harel, the guy who predicted that New York's biggest building would be attacked by Arabs. We made the prediction in 1979. So they would have had control of security of the Twin Towers then. Maybe 9/11 would have happened earlier, who knows? But there was a problem. The man who signed the contract for Atwell Security gave the name Avram Ben-Dor. It turned out pretty soon afterwards that his real name was different. It was Avram Shalom, former major executive, if you like, in Israeli intelligence, domestic intelligence, who had to stand down for ordering that two Palestinians had their heads smashed in with stones, and had to stand down as a result. When all this came out, Atwell lost the contract. So we move on to 1993. Only a few years after 1987, they're still trying to get hold of that security for some reason. And we had the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which involved an Israeli Mossad agent whose name was on the hire contract of a hire truck that was involved. And other people were blamed for it. As a result of that bombing, the completely ultra-Zionist controlled New York and New Jersey Port Authority who'd given the contract to Atwell originally in 1987. They decided, as a result of the bombing, that security at the Twin Towers had to be improved. And so they hired an ultra-Zionist company called Kroll Inc. to oversee the security, which they did right up to 2001 and the attacks. Also in 1993, a man called Morris Greenberg bought into Kroll Inc. This is the guy that provided the insurance to Silverstein and to Lowy, and was this close friend of Henry Kissinger. So we move on to Silverstein and the control of that, the lease, the buying of the lease. That was sold by the ultra-Zionist controlled guy at the time called Louis Eisenberg, a different Eisenberg, Louis Eisenberg, and who was a friend of Netanyahu. He sold it from the New York and New Jersey Port Authority into private hands for the first time. And this followed the recommendation of a guy called Ronald Lauder of the Esther Lauder family, ultra-Zionist, eventually became head of the World Jewish Congress, and not only a friend, but a funder of Benjamin Netanyahu. And he headed two organizations in New York that were given the task of deciding what should be privatized and what shouldn't. And they recommended that the Twin Towers should be privatized, and that's when Silverstein and Lowy got the contract. And so everywhere you look, in the run-up to 9/11, there were ultra-Zionists involved everywhere. The person who was Rudolph Giuliani, the mayor of New York at the time, head of emergency management, and that emergency management operation was actually in Building 7, also owned by Silverstein. He owned that before the Twin Towers. He was an ultra-Zionist as well, everywhere you look. And then you look afterwards. One of the things that would tell you why the Twin Towers fell was to have experts look over the rubble, and they'd establish why they came down. People talked about explosions just before they came down, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever happened, they would have found out. But there was this rush using a Zionist transportation company to get the rubble from ground zero into Zionist-owned scrap yards in New Jersey, where the steel, etc., was cut up around the clock and put on ships to Asia for smelting to become someone's fridge. And there is a quote in the book, which was in the New York Times, and it described the fast. Now, let's just remember here that 3,000 people were killed that day, and many thousands more of their loved ones will have had their lives decimated ever since, and they'll never fully recover. And we had no investigation into why those towers came down, and instead, the debris that could have answered those questions was taken to these scrap yards in New Jersey to be cut up as fast as possible and shipped out to Asia for smelting. This New York Times article by someone who, to be fair, even though it was the New York Times, this one actual writer was obviously seriously pissed off by what he saw. And he describes in there this scene, given that background. At one of the scrap yards, the rubble was piled up. And by the way, it's been admitted by the authorities that some body parts, body flesh, ended up filling potholes in New York roads. Story I tell in the book as well. I'm not kidding you. These are psychopaths. They don't give a shit. Anyway, this scene described by the New York Times, the piles of rubble from being brought over to from 9/11, the site of 9/11, the Twin Towers. And by the way, the company that transported them, the Zionist company that transported them, said that it was done like a military operation, moving the debris, because they were tracked. The lorries were tracked by GPS, so they always know where they were because of the sensitive material. What they did when it got the other end is dump the bloody stuff. And one driver, which the company admitted, took half an hour longer for lunch than he should have done on his journey, sacked him because they had to get from A to B without anyone having any access to it. So this New York Times article, you pile of rubble, you've got building experts trying to work out why the towers fell, who should have been doing it on site. And this article describes how they're waiting there. A big grabber comes down, grabs some stuff, moves it across. And while it's moving across, these building experts are running into the rubble, trying to find anything that's relevant, and then turning and running back before it returns. This is the scale of scam that went on, this callous psychopathy that has prevented the true story of 9/11 coming to light, and people being terrified of telling the story because of consequences for them. Well, look at me. I don't give a shit. I care about the truth, and the truth needs to come out, and at last it bloody well is. So, then we look at some other aspects of this. The last thing that the cabal wanted was this to come to court where the evidence could be put on public display. Their big problem was families, with just under 100 of them, that didn't take the compensation, which came with the proviso, you take the money, but you agree not to go to court. Nearly 100 families said, no, we're not having it. The compensation fund, pressurizing the families to take it and shut up and not go to court, was overseen by an ultra-Zionist called Kenneth Feinberg, who was also the person after 2008 that decided about executive compensation after the crash of 9/11 in all the bailouts. The crash of 2008, in all the bailouts. Now, these nearly 100 families that didn't accept that, they wanted their day in court. They wanted to have some evidence publicly displayed. They, the civil litigation group, were overseen by Judge Alvin Hellerstein, ultra-Zionist, whose son in Israel represented a law firm that represented the parent company of a Israeli intelligence agents security company called ICTS that ran security at Boston Logan Airport and at Newark, New Jersey. The company, by the way, that also ran security. These are intelligence agencies from the Israeli military intelligence, Mossad, Shin Bet, etc., the domestic intelligence agency. They also oversaw security at Paris airport when the shoe bomber got on. They oversaw the security at Schiphol, Amsterdam, when the underwear bomber got on. And as a result of the underwear bomber, Michael Chertoff, who was then in private business, he went around the television stations selling full-body scanners to make sure another underpant bomber couldn't get on. And that's why, to this day, people go through full-body scanners at airports, because of Michael Chertoff, head of the criminal division of the Justice Department at the time of 9/11, writer of the Patriot Act, head of Homeland Security, et cetera, that let all those Israelis go. Yes, ICTS was also running security at the Belgian airport when the bomb went off. I think it was 2016, and a lot of people died. So hire them, I would. And anyway, Alvin Hellerstein ran what even the mainstream media called a war of attrition to block the families getting to court. And the last one, eventually, because of a decision by Hellerstein, they pulled out in 2010. So none of the families got to court. His associates overseeing that civil litigation group of families were also ultra-Zionists. Alvin Hellerstein was also the judge that oversaw the litigation between Larry Silverstein and the airlines that ended in Silverstein getting a payout on top of the 4.56 billion of another 10 million.
Jesus.
By the way, the judge that oversaw the Silverstein v. the insurance company's litigation that led to the 4.56 billion was Michael McCasey, ultra-Zionist, who eventually became Attorney General of the United States. Then we come to this. The other problem they had, apart from the families getting to court, the other problem they had was, well, there's got to be some kind of investigation, right? We've got to have an investigation. I mean, it's the biggest terror attack in American history. 3,000 people dead. We've got to have an investigation. Well, no, if you remember, Dick Cheney, Project the New American Century, and George Bush, puppet president, resisted for ages any investigation into this attack. Why? They don't want an investigation. The truth might come out. So eventually, public pressure forces them into accepting some kind of investigation. It was called the 9/11 Commission. The person they named to head it first, Henry Kissinger. More ultra-Zionist than ultra-Zionism itself, right? So, of course, that's so ludicrous, and it was demanded that he reveal his clients in his company, Kissinger Associates, which would have, as I've said in the book, it wouldn't have just opened a can of worms. That it would have launched it to Mars, right? So now he had to stand down. So they bring another guy in, ultra-Zionist Philip Zelikow, who wrote an article in one of these influential magazines in 1998, warning America of a new Pearl Harbor and a terrorist attack on American targets. Anyway, Philip Zelikow, Bush insider, very close friend of Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State in the Bush administration, and they wrote a book together, actually. And he oversaw the 9/11 Commission, which was a joke of a non-investigation. and I go into it in the book. Building 7 was a big Achilles heel. Building 7 was owned by Silverstein before the Twin Towers. And not a lot of people, there was even a judge who I quote in the book. There was a 9/11 connected case, sometime later. And the subject in the case or the evidence of Building 7 came up. And this judge says, Building 7, what's that? Most people don't realize 3 buildings fell, not 2. And Building 7, 47 stories, also known as the Salomon Building, fell about 5:20 in the evening. In fact, about 26 minutes earlier, the BBC had a reporter reporting live saying that Building 7 had fallen, and it was still standing behind her. Right. So obviously, they've got the press release out of sync here. So it fell, and it fell with the most obvious, clear, controlled demolition you'll ever see. Where they put explosives in different parts of a building, and you see it with stadiums and big skyscrapers, and the charges go off, and they're so perfectly placed that it falls on its own footprint instead of toppling over. Exactly what, if anyone's new to this, go to YouTube, put Building 7 collapse in, and you'll see the most blatant controlled demolition you've ever seen. In fact, the explanation of the buildings coming down is so utterly ridiculous that there's an organization, as there are many others over different subject areas of 9/11, called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which are experts in their field, lots of them now, who've come together to say the explanations of the buildings falling is insane. Right. But not to the 9/11 Commission. What happened was that the building fell. It was obviously a controlled demolition. Controlled demolition experts have looked at it and have said, what brought the building down? Controlled demolition. There was one guy who's a Dutch expert. He didn't even know three buildings had fallen. And a TV crew went along and just played him the building falling and said, what do you think caused that? He said, well, it's controlled demolition. It's obvious. He didn't even know it had anything to do with 9/11. Anyway, so they've got a problem. How do you explain 47 stories and these massive, massive steel pillars collapsing simultaneously on their own footprint, which meant every single pillar had to give way at the same time? Ludicrous. So what can we do? Well, they left the investigation into this is not the 9/11 Commission. The government agency investigating the collapse of Building 7 kind of panned out their investigation. And eventually they came out. And there was a fire in Building 7. No plane hit it. No plane came near it, but there was a fire. It was not a big fire, but just a fire. Certainly not enough to bring a building like that down. In fact, according to the official story, that fire did bring it down, which made it, still to this day, the only steel-structured building ever to fall just because of fire. Of course, it didn't. It was controlled demolition. Anyway, the government agency then comes out and holds this press conference and announces what brought down a 47-story massive steel-framed building. An office furnishings fire. We're back to Prince Andrew, you see. When you're lying and you can't therefore tell the truth of what happened, it was controlled demolition, then you have to make something up, and it's usually ludicrous. So the 9/11 Commission and ultra-Zionist Philip Zelikow has looked at this. This is the 9/11 Commission report on the entire attacks, every subject area, everything. And they've thought, we can't put office furnishings fire in this report because it will get slaughtered. So what did they do? They didn't mention it. There is no mention of Building 7 collapsing in the 9/11 Commission report, because there's no way of explaining it except by controlled demolition. Now, Larry Silverstein was interviewed on a PBS documentary in America about 9/11, and he was asked about Building 7. And what he said was that the fire chief came to him and said, the fire's so bad. It wasn't. It was out by the time it fell, if you read the evidence in the book. The fire chief said to me, who's never come forward, by the way, and fire chiefs that have been, was it you that spoke to him? No, it wasn't me. Right. They've never found this guy because he doesn't exist. The fire chief came to him and said the building in Building 7, the fire is so bad that we think we ought to pull it, collapse it. And so Silverstein said, yeah, you know, there's been such a loss of life, as if he fricking cares. Yeah, let's pull it. He said, and shortly afterwards, we watched the building come down. Now, if you are going, first of all, fire commanders do not collapse buildings. Demolition experts do. And it takes weeks, sometimes longer, to put the charges in exactly the right place to bring it down. So if that was a controlled demolition, which it was, it means that the charges were put in place pre-9/11 for that to happen as fast as it did after the decision was made. Everywhere you look, in every aspect of 9/11, and I've destroyed the official story in the book, you find ultra-Zionists connected to Mossad, connected to military intelligence. By the way, you know, many of those 200 Israeli spies that were let go were found by the authorities when they were being questioned to be involved in the Israeli military, in Israeli intelligence, and in experts in areas like computers and explosives. And they were all let go. Anyway, then when you look at that whole story, and then you start picking off other aspects like you know, the planes and whether they were the ones that left the airports and the hijackers and all these other aspects, you find the whole story falls apart. Another thing, by the way, that the 9/11 Commission did not choose to mention was that in evidence to the 9/11 Commission, Norman Mineta, who was the transportation secretary, said that before the Pentagon was hit, I say it wasn't hit by a plane, it was hit by something else. But anyway, there was a plane involved, on mind. And he said he was in the bunker with Cheney, Project for the New American Century, and the towers had been hit, and they were talking about a plane heading for Washington. And Mineta tells the story of a young man, I think he was a military guy, coming in every so often and counting down a plane coming into Washington to Cheney. 50 miles, sir. 30 miles, sir. And when it got to something like, 10 miles, no time, this young guy said to Cheney, this is Norman Mineta, Transportation Secretary's evidence. He said to Cheney, do the orders still stand, sir? And Cheney, being the lovely a human being that he is, kind of, sped back. Of course, have you heard anything different? Oh, you're Dick Cheney, aren't you? Now, and then, of course, we're told that a plane hit the Pentagon. Certainly a plane was involved in that whole thing. But whether it hit the Pentagon is quite another thing. Now, do the orders still stand, sir? Now, the only way that the answer or the background to that question, do the orders still stand, sir, would have been, do the orders still stand to shoot the plane down? would have been had the plane been shot down. It wasn't. The orders had to be, and this is why you can understand the young guy being, quite, concerned the longer it went on, was that the orders were not to shoot the plane down. Which brings us to other areas of 9/11. In relation to that Flight 77 alone that is supposed to have hit the Pentagon. There is a no-fly zone around Washington. And I quote in the book Caspar Weinberger, a former U.S. Defense Secretary, after 9/11, who said there are Air Force bases all around Washington to respond to rogue planes coming in. And if they're not transmitting a certain signal, then they get shot down. Not only are there Air Force bases all around, including the Andrews Air Force Base, 10 miles from the White House and the Pentagon, there are ground-to-air missiles to protect Washington and the Pentagon. Of course there would be. Why wouldn't there be? So what happened on 9/11 then? A plane comes in and wasn't challenged, wasn't shot down, just allowed to, the official story says, hit the Pentagon. Why did did NORAD, the Air Force defense mechanism for situations like this, attacks from the air, hijackings, why did they scramble planes from 130 miles away at the Langley Air Force Base to meet a threat to Washington when 10 miles down the road is the Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One comes in with the president and where his helicopter comes from to the White House lawn? They don't have planes to scramble to protect Washington. Well, what you're having a no-fly zone for if you think you're going to police it from Langley, 130 miles away? And another thing that happened on 9/11 is that everything that could go wrong did go wrong on purpose. Probably a practice for Epstein's suicide. What happened is, I mean, it's kind of bizarre. The NORAD at a place called Rome in New York State, that area of the NORAD operation, which was its base was the Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado and at a place called Cheyenne Mountain, top secret place. But the center that was dealing with it all was call it the Need Center in Rome. I think it's not far from Syracuse in New York State. And they were obviously being completely misled for another reason I'll come to in a second about what the hell was going on. Because they were scrambling planes to meet and to go to, first of all, the Twin Towers and then to the Pentagon. And every time they were scrambled, or what happened in between happened, to make sure they were never there in time. So take this is how crazy it is. The official story, eventually, it changed many times, was they scrambled planes from Langley to get to the Pentagon for this plane coming in, American Airlines Flight 77. But when the planes took off, this is all official stuff, when the planes took off, instead of heading for Washington, pilots said no one told them what they were being scrambled for. So they say they headed out to sea because they thought the threat would come from the Atlantic, right? So instead of heading for Washington, they went out to sea, which meant they didn't get there in time. But bizarrely, NORAD did not scramble them to meet Flight 77 because this NORAD Needs Center did not know that Flight 77 had been quote, hijacked until basically the time it hit the Pentagon, or is said to have hit the Pentagon. They scrambled those jets from to meet Flight 11, which they were told had not hit the World Trade Center, but had gone past and was now heading towards Washington. I mean, the whole system was scrambled, and so when they were scrambling jets to military jets in response to the Twin Towers, they scrambled them from 153 miles away at Cape Cod. Of course, they never got there in time. And now we can open up something else. Why was there all this confusion? Why were there all these strange reports that were scrambling people that had a simple common outcome? That until the planes were down, I don't think that overwhelmingly, at least the first three, possibly all four, actually were the ones that left the airport, but the airports. Before the planes were down, nothing was done to intervene. That was the common theme. And all these different, oh, this happened, and oh my God, that happened. Oh dear, well, who told us that? It was all going on. The outcome was nothing happened to intervene. Not ground-to-air missiles, not scrambling jets, nothing. Right? Because that had to happen and be allowed to happen. I quote a guy in the book, a guy called Fletcher Prouty, who was had massive experience in the American military and in intelligence. And he said once about assassinations, if you want to know who was involved in an assassination, he said, words to this effect, just look at who had the power to remove the usual level of security that allowed the assassination to happen. And this is certainly the case with 9/11. Who had the power to call off the response system, which normally would happen very differently? I tell a story in the book of a golfer, famous golfer called Payne Stewart. Payne Stewart took off in a plane. This is 1999, something like that. He took off in a private jet, and something happened that the plane didn't pressurize, and everyone went unconscious. So what happened is what happened 125 times the previous year, and I go into the regulations in the book. They're very clear. Whenever there's a problem, even if you're not sure it's a real problem, treat it as an emergency. And the air traffic control system, the Federal Aviation Administration, contacts NORAD, and they scramble jets and they get up there. So with Payne Stewart in a small private jet and a few passengers, they went up there. They followed it because they wanted to find out what the hell was going on. It's what they always do. When it kept going and they couldn't find any sign of life. And it went so far, those jets came down, other jets came and took over, and they escorted this jet all the way across, because in the end they realized that there's no life, and eventually the plane's going to run out of fuel and it's going to crash, and they wanted to make sure that it would crash not where there was any people, right? And this whole situation, it was all in the media, was watched from the Pentagon, from the command center by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all these people, right? That's what happens. That's the normal response. On 9/11, nothing responded that made any difference whatsoever into the outcome. And immediately, the Pentagon was, quote, hit by this plane. They scrambled jets from Andrews Air Force Base 10 miles away to protect Washington. Right? It was all a scam. Now, here's another aspect of this. They had to scramble everything. And of course, no, I'm not saying the people that NORAD needs were involved. Most people were not involved. They were just completely bewildered by what's going on. So they had to have a mechanism of creating total chaos, bewilderment that morning to allow the attacks to happen? Well, it turns out that the head of NORAD, a guy called Ralph Eberhard, had, and this was the word used, had decided to have unprecedented numbers of war game scenario exercises. There was a stream of them, I list them all in the book, going on in the skies over eastern United States in precisely the areas where the planes were being, quote, hijacked. Not only that, because of the war games, planes that would normally be on the ground at Air Force bases were off during the war games. And what they have during these war games, oh, and by the way, the same Ralph Eberhard, the night before 9/11, who had orchestrated all these war games to be going on, an unprecedented number at the same time, also put the defense mechanism for Pentagon computer systems onto its lowest level. Right? Now, when these war games are going on, the flights in the game, the simulated flights, and by the way, these war games involve planes being hijacked and a plane hitting the National Reconnaissance Center in Washington, D.C., part of the scenario. Right? So they call it SIM. And what it means is the dots of the planes in the war games are on the screens of air traffic controllers and of, they have to be, of course they do, and on the screens of NORAD. And so the potential for taking planes, for landing planes after they left the airport and then they appear somewhere else is massively happened with Flight 11. It disappeared for 36 minutes. Sorry, not Flight 11, Flight 77, disappeared for 36 minutes. And I've looked at the logs and quoted some of them in the book from the NORAD Needs Center. And they are waiting for the war games to start that morning, right? And so when the reports came in of 9/11 hijackings, their first reaction was, is this, what one guy said, they started the war games early then, right? And people were saying, is this real or is this scenario? Totally scrambled them. And then they had these war games planes on their screens, completely confusing everything while the hijackings were going on. And at one point on the logs, one guy shouts out, "Get rid of the goddamn SIM!" Which they did after the Pentagon was hit. And now, there was a company in Quincy, Massachusetts, called P-Tech. P-Tech was apparently a small company, but it was given the contract for the computer systems of NORAD, the Federal Aviation Administration, all the Washington institutions, the Pentagon, etc. And it was identified by a lady, a computer tech wizard at some level. She worked on projects for J.P. Morgan, called Indira Singh. And her first interest in P-Tech, from her knowledge, because she worked in that industry, was something called, they call it enterprise architecture. And the whole deal of connecting different computer systems. And to do that job, you need to have access in real time to all the computer systems of the different agencies, right? P-Tech had that. Now, her first interest was when she started to realize that people who were funding P-Tech were also people who were being accused of funding Osama bin Laden. Right? So her first response is, this is how the Arabs did it, basically. That kind of, why are people funding bin Laden involved in this P-Tech that's got control of all these computer systems? And P-Tech was working with a federally funded company called the Icke Corporation. And according to Indira Singh and others, they were working, the Icke Corporation and P-Tech, in the basement of the Federal Aviation Administration for 2 years before 9/11, working on all the computer systems and computer connections with other agencies. And one of the big things that came out in this confusion of 9/11 was the apparent inability of these agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration and NORAD to communicate with each other. It was come to absolute chaos, absolute mess. Well, P-Tech had control in real time of everything it needed to control to put planes on screens that weren't there, to take planes off screens that were there, all of it on 9/11. Well, it turns out that P-Tech wasn't controlled by Arabs, was controlled by ultra-Zionists. And there was a Mossad agent called Viktor Ostrovsky who wrote 2 books in the 1990s, the first came out in 1990, who said how Israeli intelligence uses Arab people and Israelis who look like Arabs to appear to have Arab control of companies when actually they're Israeli companies. So this was a classic. There was a guy whose father was a big player in that area in B'nai B'rith, the big Masonic connected, Rothschild-controlled, instigated, in fact, ultra-Zionist, basically secret society. And this guy was running P-Tech. And then when I started researching that, you come out and you see all these computer companies in America in significant positions, were all controlled by Zionists. What you find when you research this is there basically aren't any cybersecurity companies operating out of Israel that are not controlled by Mossad and the military and the intelligence network. And I could talk about that as well, because Israel is becoming a massive global center for technology. And one of the areas of technology that they focus on is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity means that you write the security blueprint. And when you write it, you leave back doors in so that Mossad can get into anything.
I think the Maxwell sisters were accused of this recently.
Well, the Maxwell sisters were accused of that. Well, that's kind of interesting because one of these systems called Promise, which was developed by an American company for probably quite, benevolent reasons, was hijacked by the American government and Israeli Mossad, Israeli military. And back doors were put in it, and they sold this Promise software to governments all over the world with a back door in which they could get in and get everything. You know who one of the biggest sellers of it was? This has come from Ostrovsky and others. Bob Maxwell. Because Bob Maxwell, father of Ghislaine Maxwell, was a Mossad agent. And Ostrovsky describes how when he died on his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, it wasn't because he fell overboard. It was because Mossad came up from the water and killed him because he was starting to become a liability instead of a positive contribution to their agenda. Remember, his Daily Mirror empire was falling and all that stuff. So Maxwell was selling it. He was a Mossad agent. So that makes absolute sense what you've just said, as does Ghislaine Maxwell's involvement with the Mossad agent Jeffrey Epstein. Ehud Barak, Epstein. Here we go. I mean, in the end, it's a web, and therefore, if you work hard enough and dig deep enough, you will connect it because it is a web. So you had on 9/11 computer control of the entire system. And to scramble, which is what happened, and create total confusion, which is what happened, to make sure nothing happened that would intervene in it playing out, was all in their hands at that same time. Now, I'm going to go back to a figure. The Jewish population of the world is 0.2%. The number of people that are involved in what I'm talking about is a tiny fraction of the 2%, and that tiny fraction hates the rest of the 2%. Now look at how many times I've said ultra-Zionist in this interview in relation to 9/11. What are the statistical chances of any of that?
None.
None. So then you ask, if I can find this out, and others, is a guy in America, Christopher Boland, who's done a lot of great work in this area. Why can't the media? And why do even people in the alternative media who get some sniff of this never talk about it? Because they're terrified of the consequences. They're terrified of being called anti-Semitic, when what you're actually doing is the opposite of that. Anti-Semitic's a misnomer anyway. It actually means anti-Arab, if you take back its meaning. But it's pointing out to the Israeli community and to the Jewish community worldwide, you are being shafted big time and taking the blame for what this cult is doing in your name, even though you don't even know it exists. And so it really is time for all of us to put the labels down and to put all the fault lines of division down. Stop seeing ourselves as Jew or Arab or middle-class American just for a second, and realize we're all being shafted equally, and come together and deal with this in unity, because they are desperate for us to go on being divided and ruled and at war with each other. And this whole anti-Semitism industry, this protection racket for the cult, it's what it is designed to stop what I've been talking about coming out. And I don't care about consequences, never think of them. Because if you think about consequences, what you're doing is you're pondering the possibility that you won't do what you believe to be right because of the consequences. Well, that's not going to happen. So why am I thinking about consequences? Because I'm going to do it anyway. And we need to start going down this road and not being intimidated into silence, and not being intimidated into sharing things. I tell you what's kind of fascinating now. You see how this gets more and more deeper inroded into people's behavior. I can, my boys anyway, post news stories from my site on social media, and I do memes with lots of them, comment memes, and when they are about this subject or that subject, they'll get shared. You talk about Zionism or Israel, they don't get shared. Why? Because they're worried about what will an employer do. He might look at my social media account, which they do now. So, oh no, you're an anti-Semite, even though what you're saying is, why is this happening? Why are these people always being protected. And we've just got to grow some backbone because the evidence is there and it just needs to come out. And this is another interesting thing, you see. I went on to talk radio in Britain. I did 2 interviews with them, maybe in the last year or so. And their combined audience, views on YouTube of those 2 interviews is well now in excess of 3 million. They, copies of The Trigger were sent to about 3 or 4 programs. Wouldn't have me on. They were sent to RT, question more. Wouldn't have me on. Jamie had 5,000 press releases sent out to media organizations in America, North America, Canada, Britain, all over the place. Not one mainstream media organization came back. When you are, and you see it's not a short book, producing the evidence that demolishes the official story of 9/11. Now, for that not to be orchestrated is ridiculous. They didn't even want to talk about the things that didn't mention the cult. Things like the fact that it's never been established that the planes that were said to have hit the buildings were the planes that left the airports. Do you know whenever there's an air crash, the first thing investigators do, or one of them, is they establish they've got the right plane. And they do this very easily. Every part on a plane has a serial number. The plane itself has a serial number. You know, we talk about Flight 77 and Flight 11, but they're just like destination boards on a bus. It's not the bus; it's just the route it's taking at the time. The bus has an identification number, a number plate, and so do planes. So what they do is they look at the debris, and there's certain parts, certain parts, they're called time change parts. These are parts that, never mind if they're not damaged, if it's flown this period, it's got to be changed, right? So, and what they do then is when a part is changed, that's logged, its serial number is logged on the mechanics log. And so what they do when there's a crash is they look at a part, they compare it with the log, and they say, yeah, we got the right plane. That was not done with any of the 9/11 planes. And it was so glaring that people challenged this, of course. And under the Freedom of Information Act, they asked for the FBI to release documents to show that this process had happened. And the FBI replied that it had not happened because, quote, there was no question as to the identity of the planes. Well, of course, you read the book, there's massive questions, the identity of the plane, but it was never done. So if you don't do something that's done every other time, there's a reason you haven't done it. The same 4 planes, none of the pilots hit the 4-digit code, hijack code, which is the first thing they're supposed to do. Bang, 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 done. None of the pilots hit the hijack code to say they'd been hijacked. No one among the cabin staff instigated hijack procedure. Everything they would normally do didn't happen. That's not criticizing them. It's saying the official story is not true. There's a reason that those pilots did not punch in the hijack code. I say the planes were taken over from the ground, and in taking them over by hijacking the computer, that code wouldn't work because no messages from the cockpit to the ground would have been allowed. And remember, this control of the computer system would have included control of the planes. They controlled everything, all the computer system. The Federal Aviation civilian system, NORAD system, all of it. And everywhere you look, there's there's unexplainables, and there's things that normally happen that that didn't happen on 9/11. It's a lie from start to bloody finish, because the official story is just a cover to hide the fact that 19 Arab hijackers did not hijack those planes.
Do you believe those people were disposed of then? And are there inconsistencies with the flight and cockpit data and recordings?
Oh,
phone
loads.
calls?
Flight 93. There's an organization called Pilots for 9/11 Truth. These are pilots, some of whom flew those actual planes, who have come together, like the engineers and architects, to say this story of the planes makes no sense. And I go into it in the book. It's devastating. See, there were no black boxes found, they say, for the planes that hit the Twin Towers, right? Even though they're orange and give off a signal. The flight data recorder that records the workings of the plane and what happened with the plane's basically engineering, etc., was said to have been found with Flight 93 and was said to have been found with Flight 77. What pilots for 9/11 Truth did is they got the authorities dealing with this to send them the information from these black boxes, and they, with an animation showing a animated plane following that information, showing what happened. Flight 93. Flight data recorder shows cockpit door never opened. How was it hijacked? Flight 77, the cockpit data recorder, not the cockpit voice recorder, the plane data recorder, shows a different route to the official story. A route that, if taken, would not have been able to hit the Pentagon, would have been too high. And this is another story about 9/11, you see. My feeling, having researched this at great length over 2 books now, is that a plane never hit the Pentagon. But there are reports that people say they saw an airliner, and there are other people that say they saw a very small jet that kind of whizzed past just before the next explosion. Well, for me, one of 2 things has happened. Either the Pentagon was hit by a missile. When, as I show in the book, missiles existed that would have done exactly what that one did. And that would explain why the hole in the Pentagon was so small. Because, of course, people remember the wall falling, but that happened, half an hour, 40 minutes afterwards. Before that, there was only a little hole. 125 feet wingspan jet's going to get through that. Either it was hit by a missile, and there's a very good chance of that, or there was a bomb, or both. There's evidence that there was at least a bomb. But of course, there had to be a cover story, and people saw a jet. And for me, what happened is the jet did come in and pulled away. And so when the bomb went off or the missile hit, people associated the plane with the explosion. And there was a police security officer at the Pentagon called Roosevelt Roberts. And he was in a place where they deliver things, just inside the Pentagon. And he heard the bang of the explosion. And he ran out, of course. And what he said, and this was, he recorded an interview, I think, for the official record. He said there was this massive jet, silver, which was, of course, the colors of American Airlines, and it was very, very low, and it was climbing out, away from the Pentagon. This is after the explosion. And people, when they saw this plane going up, they talked about a second plane. That this is why there was confusion. People were saying there was one plane. Other people say, no, there was two planes. Well, maybe there was one plane and something else that caused the explosion, which would certainly explain a lot of the contradictions of the evidence, where people saw one thing and other people saw another. If you put them all together, because, I've quoted people in the book who were in the Pentagon and ran out of the Pentagon when the attack happened. And they say there was no plane debris. Crucially, a plane with lots of fuel in the tank. There was no smell of aviation fuel, nothing. The book is devastating in all these subjects because, I'm giving an overview here. Of course, it's all you can do in an interview. But the detail is devastating to support what I'm saying.
So the mainstream media then say the architect, the supervillain, is Osama bin Laden, but the other face that's all over the news is Mohammed Atta, whose passport miraculously just floats out of the inferno so he can be identified.
Well, it wasn't Mohammed Atta, it was another one. But I mean, even that, how desperate are you? See, we, the longer we talk, the more you keep coming back to the same strands, because it's, everything connects to everything else. I was talking earlier about control of perception. So they know, because if they're experts on anything, I mean the inner core, they're experts on human perception because that's their stadium. It's their source of control. They know that people don't overwhelmingly look at detail. They get an image of something, a feeling. So you announce that a passport has been found in Vesey Street near the Twin Towers that's supposed to have fallen out of a plane that smacked into the building in a fireball. And they found it. I mean, was it singed? I mean, what's going on? And what they're looking for is this feeling. And this is another thing, I studied for a long time mind control and these mind control projects and what have you, and mind control techniques. And one major mind control technique, one major mind control, kind of everyone knows that in the mind control industry, is if you get people into a state of trauma, they become massively suggestible. And of course, people looking at the horrors of 9/11 were in, whether they were directly involved or not, there was some kind of trauma from just looking on. And in that traumatized state, you start hitting them with information, suggestions. So they're looking for, see, it was them Arabs. Look, they found one of the passports. And of course, as I mentioned in the book, a year after 9/11, a British television crew from ITV asked New York police about the hijacker passport, which they, with the FBI, said, we found it. And they said, that's a rumor that might be true. Well, of course, it wasn't a rumor, and it certainly wasn't true. It was a scam to underpin the official story. What they want is to put out the official story, like Ehud Barak, Osama bin Laden, Afghanistan, and then underpin it as fast as you can and lock in that belief system, that perception, which then is going to take some moving once it's locked in. That's how it works. It's all a mind game. So Mohammed Atta, first of all, the discrepancies in the description of Mohammed Atta, who used the name Mohammed El Amir in Germany as a student, and Mohammed Atta, they weren't the same people. They might have looked the same in some ways, even, but that's not impossible, is it? But they weren't the same person. Even the height was like 4 inches difference. El Amir was described as a lovely, nice man and very caring and, like a straight Muslim. And Mohammed Atta, hey, man, don't mess with me. What? You're this guy from Germany? Hey, Mohammed Attar, right? He is an extreme Muslim fanatic. He's willing to fly this plane into a building and kill thousands of people, all right? And because he cares about Allah and all that stuff. Really? Well, as I describe in the book, he had a girlfriend called Amanda Keller, confirmed by other people, in Venice, in Florida, which is where the Israeli spy ring was actually based in Florida. So were these guys. And she described that how the flying school, and actually I knew this anyway, before 9/11, the Venice airport was notorious conduit for the CIA Bush, which you all know about, the CIA Bush Clinton drug running operation, bringing the stuff out of South America into America. Venice Airport was one of the centers, which just happened to be where Mohammed Attar trained as a pilot. These coincidences are amazing. Anyway, Amanda Keller describes how this Muslim fanatic Attar, his favorite food was pork chops. He was always getting drunk. And she said when they ran out of cocaine, one night, her and a friend, because he was producing the cocaine, they lived at a place called the Sandpiper Apartments in Venice. They followed them. They followed Attar and his mate into the flying school at Venice Airport, and they came out with armfuls of coke to resupply. This is a Muslim fanatic who's going to kill himself. And I followed the story of Attar. I mean, it's a joke. Like I say, nothing stands up to scrutiny once you get into that. Then you have Flight 77 was supposed to have been piloted by a guy called Annie Henshaw. And Annie Henshaw flew this plane, it said, Flight 77, a 757 jet, big plane. He flew it. Actually, the way they came in, he could have parked it in exactly the place in the Pentagon where Rumsfeld and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were. But instead, what he did is he took it across in a big circle, which people from Pilots for 9/11 Truth have tried to redo on a simulator, and they couldn't do it, and only a few actually managed it. These are top pilots. And he parks it in one part of the Pentagon called Wedge 1, which had just been reinforced to protect the Pentagon from such an attack. An attack they said they'd never thought of before 9/11. Wedge 1, where it hit and killed a lot of people, was where the accountants were trying to find the missing $2.3 trillion that was announced to be missing from the Pentagon budget on September the 10th, 2001. Right. Now, Annie Henshaw, master pilot, which the 9/11 Commission said he would seem to be the most skillful pilot, basically the best pilot of the bunch. He was banned 6 weeks earlier from hiring a one-engine plane at an airport flying school because he was so incompetent and dangerous. It's madness. It's unbelievable. But it shows that purely by repetition of nonsense and by the mainstream media underpinning the nonsense instead of challenging it, you can get vast numbers of people, though not as many as they think there are, to believe that complete idiocy, impossibility was actually what happened.
So you talked about the Bush drug trafficking. Just a quick opportunity here to mention to people, my new book is now out for Christmas. It's called Clinton, Bush, and CIA Conspiracies: From the Boys on the Tracks to Jeffrey Epstein. And it's on Amazon, ebook, paperback, and hopefully we'll have the audio book back up soon. From speaking to you, David, from reading all of your books, go to David's website if you want to get this one. It will help him more than putting more money in Bezos' pocket. From researching Epstein, from just speaking to you today, it's just really reinforced how cults do control the world, especially with this Epstein stuff right now. Apparently, there's all these powerful people. You mentioned Elon Musk linked with Epstein, Bill Gates linked with Epstein, Prince Andrew, and so on and so on. Now, I did watch on the Joe Rogan podcast, he interviewed a lady out of Hawaii called Tulsi.
Tulsi Gabbard.
And she is saying she's going to stop the wars. She's the new hope. Yeah. What are you calling on this?
What I'm calling on this is that Tulsi Gabbard has been very consistent. She has been opposing these wars from the start. And the moment she stood up and said she was running as a presidential candidate with the Democrats, the demonization started. Not least within the Democratic Party, which is, of course, a war party, controlled by the same cult ultimately, just like the Republicans are. I'm sure there are many, many things that me and Tulsi would not agree on. I sent her a copy of that book, actually. Whether she got it or not is another thing. Because she's also the political voice in the last 2-3 weeks who's been pushing for an investigation into Saudi Arabia and supporting the families of 9/11 victims who are trying to take the Saudi government to court over their involvement. She's been very, very consistent on this. And there'll be many things in other areas I'm sure we wouldn't agree on. But I like her consistency on opposing the wars and going and meeting Assad, for which she's getting vilified, and that's been ever since, to try to reach some accommodation and to understand. What do you mean you're not supposed to meet Assad? Do you want to understand what's happening? Do you want to understand where he's coming from so we can resolve this or not? But of course, they don't want to resolve it. And when you meet someone, you might find that actually they're not quite the demon you thought they were. And they want us to think these are all demons so that we'll justify or support their attacks upon them. So I think on that, Tulsi Gabbard is genuine and the best of luck to her. On other things, I'm sure we'll, if it starts to impact upon the woke agenda, I'm sure we wouldn't agree. And certainly on climate change, we wouldn't agree.
So she is a Gulf War veteran, I believe. And
she is. She's still a serving veteran. She works in the medical side of it, I think.
So she's got the support of the veteran community. A lot of people have been abandoned when they come back from these wars, end up in prison, suicides, all this horror stuff. If she, with all of this support, it looked like she was going to win, or she actually won, would the deep state go JFK on her?
Well, if you look at what they've done to Trump, I'm no supporter of Trump, but you look what they've done to Trump whenever he's not gone full-blown deep state. Well, you multiply that a few thousand times, and that's what Tulsi Gabbard would get. Because I do think she's genuine on this issue. I think she's genuine, and if you're genuine and you are coming in to make that difference, you're going to have she's got the Democratic Party establishment against her already, and if she ran against Trump, she might have a chance of beating him. The other rabble, have you seen them? They haven't got a brain cell to rub together. But still, she's attacked by her own party because that's a cult party. You got Trump; he's controlled by the cult. That's why Israel gets everything it wants from Trump, no questions asked. Everything virtually. The only thing they've not quite got yet is an actual bombardment of Iran. And so they're not going to just let her do it. But we need to support people. I mean, I don't, recommend that people support any political party. I just want people to have the information from which to make their own minds up. But if someone is genuinely, if they got into power and they were genuinely trying to, stop this nonsense, then they need maximum support from people, because they're going to have the world and his friend, the cult, ultimately, trying to destroy them. Absolutely.
So Hillary Clinton is already saying that Tulsi's working for the Russians. What do you think of that, and what do you think of Hillary Clinton?
Well, the thing is that, when some people attack you, you're on the right track. I use that all the time. He's having a go at you. Good. I'm saying something right then. And so Clinton attacking her is confirming that she's standing for something the cult doesn't want to stand for, because she is a cult operative. Bill Clinton and the Clintons, they are cult to their DNA. And if she got to power, then all hell would break loose. And we've reached a point now in politics. We reached it quite a long time ago, but it's more obvious than ever before that there is no choice in terms of the major players. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because the parties are so controlled by the same force that they decide who gets in, not the public. And we've seen what with the Brexit referendum, what contempt the system has for the public making the quote wrong decision. So I wish Tulsi well, because she's going to need it if she does progress.
David, you've been very generous with your time as
No
usual.
problem.
And is this possibly the longest podcast we've ever filmed? What are we at?
3 hours 20.
3:20?
We've only just begun, Sean.
It's close.
We've scratched the surface.
And if you want the rest below the surface, the trigger, all the links are in the description box below this video. Is there anything you would like to say in conclusion to the viewers and the young people watching this?
Well, I have a term, the mainstream everything. The mainstream everything, whether it's mainstream science, mainstream media, mainstream politics, mainstream everything, is telling you what the mainstream everything's ultimate controllers, which if you go deep enough is the cult, wants you to believe. So the mainstream media basically says question nothing. Then you've got RT saying question more, but not too much. And then you've got people like me who say question everything, everything. Take everything off the table as a gimme. Familiarity is a wonderful way of mind controlling perception, because once something becomes familiar, it becomes a gimme, it becomes unquestioned. That's just how things are. Everyone knows that, mate. Question everything. And when you do, you'll see almost none of it stands up, not least the nature of reality and who we are and where we are.
And in the event you are deplatformed, where are you going to be that people can find you?
Well, we've just started a new platform, which I hope you'll be interviewed for.
Cheers.
Called Iconic. I say we. Actually, my son Jamie has put it together. It's brilliant. I was so impressed when he unveiled it. And basically, what we were looking at was this incessant censorship and deplatforming and all this stuff, and through what I call the mainstream internet. Google owned YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all these things. Again, go deep enough, cult. And that's why they're censoring people that are exposing aspects of the cult agenda. That's what it's all about. So you can either sit around and moan about it and say, oh, tough in it. Oh, I'm a martyr. Or you can say, okay, are we going to deal with it? And so what Jamie's done is put this media platform together, which is, it's got films, it's got series, always being added to. He's going to make a film about 5G. It's already an enormous amount of content on it. Lots of stuff that I've done. Every talk that I've ever done that was filmed and stuff, it's all on there. So that it's not dependent on YouTube, and it's not dependent on Facebook. It's its own self-contained entity. Not just for now, because there's a lot of stuff on it already, but the censorship's not going to just stop here, is it? We know that, so we have to deal with it and prepare for it, and that's what we've done.
How many books have you published?
Oh, God knows. God, 20 odd must be.
I read.
I'm 3 chapters from finishing another one. I'll finish another one by February.
Can you mention what that's about?
What the hell we do about all this.
Good.
And that's plenty.
The first one I read was in maximum security jail in Arizona. Guy just slides Alice in Wonderland 9/11 under my door, and that I just never looked back after reading that content. So if you want to support David as well as the books, it's free to subscribe to his channel. Go down, click over to his YouTube channel. All his socials are down there. And a huge thank you to the people who have donated some money to us to help the production of these podcasts at this level in the studio. People who've donated to Patreon, PayPal, Just Giving. It's because of you guys, this is possible, and we've been able to interview David in here today. And also, huge thank you to all the new subscribers. Subscribers shot up a couple hundred thousand in the last few months, and subscription logo is down there on the bottom right-hand corner of this video. And the best way to finish this is on a message of love, so I'm going to give David a big hug now.
Oh, there you go, man.
Yeah, this is the example.
Nice talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
Nice.